Hi, so today we're going to talk about the characteristics of life. So by the end of this PowerPoint, you should be able to identify the characteristics of life. So biology, the prefix bio, if you take a look at this right here, the prefix bio means life and ology means the study of. So biology is the study of life or the study of living things. It's specifically an organized and scientific framework for posing and answering questions about the natural world around us. So what do biologists study? Well, biologists can study a number of things. They take a look at how things work, how does life interact with one another, and then how do the different things that occur inside a living thing, how do those things happen? Again, how organisms interact with not only each other but their environment, and then again how organisms change over time. So the characteristics of life are what biologists use to determine what is living versus what is non-living. Because if you're going to study life, the first thing you need to do is figure out what's living. So biologists have 8 characteristics that they use to distinguish living things from non-living things. And those are organization in cells, the universal genetic code, response to stimuli, homeostasis, metabolism, growth and development, reproduction, and change over time, or the ability for populations to evolve over time. We're going to take a closer look at each one of these. So the first characteristic is organization and the presence of cells. A cell is the smallest unit of life that can perform all life's processes. So a single-celled or a unicellular organism is a living thing. Because it has all of the characteristics of life as well. Also, all living things have some degree of organization. And organization is just a high degree of order within an organism and its interactions with the living world. So all living things start out with have an organized atomic structure, and those atoms form molecules, and those molecules end up coming together to form organelles. Those organelles make cells, which is our basic unit of life. Now those cells group together to form tissues, organs, organ systems, and organisms. So we've got a high degree of order within all living things, and even if you take a look at a living thing, there's even organization within that living thing. So if you take, for example, us humans, we've got our head is on the top of our bodies, our limbs are off to the sides, we've got our hearts in the center of our chests, our lungs are, surrounding our hearts. So, all living things have that kind of organization as well. So all living things have a universal genetic code, and that universal genetic code is DNA. It is also can be RNA. So RNA or ribonucleic acid is also part of the universal genetic code. So some living thing or all living things have DNA and RNA, so that's part of our universal genetic code. So their third characteristic is response to stimuli. So all living things respond to stimuli, whether it's physical, and a stimulus is just a physical or chemical change in the internal or external environment. So for an example of response to stimuli is when your pupils either contract or dilate in response to light. So if you are in a dark room, you'll have a dilated pupil, but as soon as the lights come on in the room, your pupil will contract because it doesn't need to allow so much light. Another example of a stimulus is your stomach growling. That's an example of an internal stimulus versus a light going on or off, which is an external stimulus. So an internal stimulus is like, again, your stomach growling to let you know that you're hungry and it's time to eat. Our fourth characteristic of life is homeostasis. So all living things want to maintain a stable internal environment So even though the external environment is constantly changing, throughout the day, there's temperature fluctuations, there's light fluctuations. So the external environment is constantly changing, but living things like to maintain a stable internal environment. So an example of homeostasis is if you've ever run the mile, human body temperature is 98.6 degrees. And when you start to run the mile, you start to get warm and your body temperature goes up. As your body temperature goes up above 98.6 degrees, your body then responds by sweating in order to cool you down and bring your body temperature back down to homeostasis, which is 98.6 degrees. In contrast, if you've ever walked out of the house, forgot a jacket, and it's really cold outside, and your body temperature starts to drop below 98.6 degrees, you start to shiver, you wrap your arms around yourself and you kind of try and warm yourself up with some friction. So that's another example of homeostasis, just in the opposite direction. So another characteristics of life is metabolism, or the ability to obtain and use energy. So metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions that take in and transform energy and materials from the environment. So this is the ability to take in food, break that food down, and transform it into a form of energy that cells can use and be able to use that energy. So that's metabolism. Our sixth characteristic of life is growth and development. So growth is the division and enlargement of cells. So growth involves cell division. The organism typically gets bigger in size. Development is a process by which an organism becomes a mature adult, and it takes place over the lifetime of the organism. That's key. So growth is just the physical enlargement of an organism. Development takes place over a longer period of time, usually the lifetime of the organism, and it's when the organism goes through stages of development until they reach a mature adult. Development also involves cell division, so development also involves growth, as well as cell differentiation and specialization. So here's some examples of growth and development. So over here on the left-hand side, you've got growth, and you see it's an example of a grasshopper. So you start out with eggs, and then the cells get larger and divide, and you end up with a young nymph, and then an older nymph, and then an adult. So if you take a look at the young nymph and the adult, they're exactly identical to each other. The only difference is one is larger, so the adult is a larger form. So that's an example of growth. Development, on the other hand, is stages. When you think of development, you should think stages of development. So an example of a caterpillar transforming to a butterfly is an example of development. So we start with an egg, we go to a caterpillar, then a pupa, then an emerging butterfly, and then an adult butterfly, and we start this cycle over again. So at the end, we end up with an adult organism. Our second to last characteristic of life is reproduction. So all organisms produce new organisms like themselves, and they transmit their hereditary information onto their offspring. So that's DNA. There's two different types of reproduction. There's asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is similar to cloning, where the organism is making an exact copy of itself. The benefit of asexual reproduction is that you can increase a population size dramatically over a short period of time. So if we take an example of bacteria reproduce asexually through binary fission. And one bacteria becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16. So they grow exponentially, they divide, and that population ends up growing exponentially. So you can get a relatively large number of bacteria in a very short period of time. So let's say 24 hours, you might end up with billions of bacteria, all because of asexual reproduction. The Downside to asexual reproduction is that all of the bacteria are going to be genetically identical to each other. Now, why is that a bad thing? Well, antibiotics work on this idea that, bacteria reproduce asexually. So antibiotics are designed to kill bacteria. So if one bacteria ends up being killed by an antibiotic, then all of them will be. So organisms that reproduce asexually are more susceptible to things like diseases or toxins and things like that, because if the disease or toxin kills one of them, it's going to kill the rest of the population as well, unless there was a mutation that happened to take place. Sexual reproduction is when two organisms contribute their genetic information to the next generation. And our last characteristic of life is change through time or evolve. So all organisms or all populations of organisms are able to evolve or change over time. So that's the key here. Individuals can change over their lifespan, but individuals don't evolve. Populations of organisms evolve, and that is key. So individuals may change. You might get a cut on your arm and end up having a scar. So you may change, but your genetics don't change. So the only way to get a population to evolve is through different types of mutations that end up being selected for by the environment. And we'll go into that later on this year. So we've just reviewed the characteristics of life. Now that we've gone through them, you should be able to describe each of the characteristics of life and be able to give an example of each.